and here physically occupying space. We're looking forward to having a talk today by Nick Murray. Nick's an Australian researcher. He's from South Australia originally, ended up doing his postgraduate work, if I got it right, at Griffith University and UQ, with a very good conservation biology, outstanding conservation biology group there. Nick is one of these people, it seems like there's various kinds of researchers these days. They start off as biologists, or they start off as working with organisms and ecosystems, and they end up migrating to the virtual world of supercomputers and satellite data and that type of thing. So Nick is one of these fellows that's making this transition, and he's using huge data sets to try to understand the ecology and particularly the conservation of mangrove ecosystems around the world. So he's very plugged in. He has an outstanding publication record, very plugged in on this, and he's got a DECRA fellowship right now, which of course are very prestigious. And he's had several really important research awards, including, I think it's an APEC award that seem to be particularly prominent. So he's doing good work. He's publishing a lot. He's being very prominent, and we're very happy to have him here talking to us about losses and gains of Earth's intertidal ecosystems. Thanks, Nick.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you virtually, even though I was planning on being in Cairns this week. That didn't eventuate due to the lockdown in Brisbane. But yeah, as Bill said, I've kind of got a background in pure ecology and spatial ecology, and then I'm slowly changing to computational biology to answer these questions that get bigger and bigger the more you look at them. And so today I'm really excited to introduce a project I've been working on for the last 2.5 years as part of my DECRA fellowship, which is an extension of some work I started off in 2016, which was originally funded by Google to me and my collaborators at University of Queensland and University of New South Wales. I'm going to take you on a sort of journey of remote sensing and the sort of global scale work that's possible these days. And I invite you to sort of think of those sorts of questions that are similar to the ones that I'm answering in the coastal zone, and really think broadly about some of the systems you're working on and how these types of new cutting edge global analyses might be useful for your own purposes. So to begin with, just a quick view of what the world is like now. This is Tokyo Bay in Japan, and at a time, a long time ago, this bay was fringed by coastal ecosystems. And in particular, there was a coastal ecosystem here called tidal flats. These are these mud flats that you can see all over the world, including right on the Esplanade in Cairns and along Townsville shoreline as well. A coastal ecosystem that's really important for supporting migratory shorebirds and providing defences for storms and a whole bunch of other ecosystem services. Now, a couple of years ago, we wanted to get an understanding of the distribution of this ecosystem type, mainly because I was working on the conservation of migratory shorebirds in Australia. These birds that had been just disappearing and populations collapsing under a project led by Richard Fuller up here on the right. And so Richard and Stuart Finn and a bunch of other people and I got together to work out the distribution of tidal flat ecosystems. Basically, everywhere you go in Asia, you'll find this ecosystem. But at the time, in 2015, we had really no good understanding of the distribution of it on the planet. And there are a number of reasons for that. Most foremost is that anytime you look at a tidal flat, it might be high tide and you might not actually be able to get a view of it. And so it's actually a very difficult remote sensing problem. And it took a really unique remote sensing solution to get at the distribution of an ecosystem where a lot of the time it's just impossible to view from space. Now, I met a few people from the Google Earth Engine development team in about 2012 or 13 in San Francisco, actually. And I told them about this problem of wanting to make a map of an ecosystem that we can rarely see from space. And in the past, I used to spend months downloading satellite images and developing methods to make maps of it. And it was right at a time that Google Earth Engine was setting up, maybe about a year after the first version of the Global Forest Watch data came out. So I was really aware of the potential of this system that co-located all of the USGS Landsat archive, millions of images, which, you know, I used to download about 10,000. It would take about a month when I was at UQ. These days, now we can have a set of computers that can analyze Landsat data without ever really needing to move it. What we do now is we send just a couple of kilobytes of code to the system, the Google Earth Engine system, and that allows us to direct the system to analyze just enormous amounts of satellite data. And so working with Google and this problem of trying to map an ecosystem where really you need to look at every single satellite image ever acquired in the coastal zone to identify those where it's low tide and we can see the full extent of tidal flat ecosystems. Working with them, we developed a classification workflow, a remote sensing classification workflow that allowed us to develop the first maps of a previously unmapped ecosystem on Earth. We developed it using a machine learning sort of modern remote sensing analysis workflow, which requires training data and informative predictor layers and a whole bunch of computations to analyze every single Landsat pixel and assign it to whether or not it's a tidal flat or not. If I'd started this analysis on my computer, when this project started, you know, I'd be waiting for another 20 years for it to be able to finish the analysis. But luckily, Earth Engine allowed me to just boost my potential to run classification models like this one. We ran it on 22,000 machines and it ran in about 40 days and we were able to return the first maps of tidal flat ecosystems on Earth. And an example of this is this one here. So what we did is develop a time series workflow where we make a map of a tidal flat ecosystem for every 3 years across the entire world's coastal zone. We analyze every single Landsat pixel in the coastal zone, and we identify pixels which have a sort of high probability of being a tidal flat ecosystem. And so what you're looking at here is the data set cycling through 11 time steps. And this is Incheon or Seoul in South Korea. So this is a hugely developed coastline which has these enormous tidal flats, 10 or 15 kilometers in some instance at low tide. And what I want to point to you at is purple means that it was tidal flat a long time ago in the 1980s. And then yellow is the most recent time step in the data set. And so if I freeze it, what you're looking at here is these patches of purple that you can see in the final map were once tidal flat ecosystems, but are not anymore. And each different color represents a different time step in the analysis. So ones that are sort of green are about 2005 was the last time we saw them before they became a city or a port or some other new land cover type. So all of these purple areas represent tidal flats lost over time. And if I zoom into this area here, a lot of us have probably been to it. What we're looking at here is an enormous area of tidal flat between two islands, which is not tidal flat anymore when we run the classification workflow for the most recent time periods in 2016. What we're actually looking at is the world's 4th most expensive airport, built in between islands on the coastline of South Korea, on what was formerly tidal flat. Free land, basically, for the government, completely flat, easy to just develop, brand new. So this is a type of loss, we call it reclamation around the world's coastlines. And we, for the first time with this analysis, were able to put some numbers on how much of this type of development's occurred over the last 30 years. Now, with the data set, we've made it completely freely available. The code is all available, and it's supported a lot of really nice conservation outcomes. For instance, just 2 weeks ago, tidal flats in South Korea were listed as a World Heritage Area, and some of the support for that was just how large they are compared to other ones on the planet, which up until about 2019, when we first published the data set, couldn't really be assessed beyond anything besides just an expert opinion. But now we can put some numbers on just how many hectares of tidal flats there are in southern South Korea versus, say, Australia or any other country on Earth. It also supported, just as an example from what originally motivated the study, was the threatened listing of migratory shorebirds in Australia. One of the criteria that we use for listing threatened species on the EPBC Act is change in habitat area. And in this case, the Commonwealth Government were able to put some numbers on how much tidal flats have been lost across the migratory flyway for these 6 species of migratory shorebirds. And now some of them are listed as critically endangered on the EPBC Act, where one of the points of evidence was how much their habitat had declined over time. Now, some other nice outcomes of this project was that the general classification workflow of running really big machine learning classifications of pixels on Google Earth Engine. Google funded us again, funded a different team, still led by me, in 2017 to make an online app, basically for a national park manager in any country to be able to go and make a map of their land covers. If they could identify what they wanted to map and develop a training set for it using the app, we could run it through Google Earth Engine and deliver a classified map for them. And we developed a 2-step classification, which let any user develop a map for the year 2000 and a map for the year 2016 and estimate changes over time. So it's been used by more than, I think it's like more than 20,000 people at last count. So it's being used around the world for basic remote sensing classifications, which can sort of be run in a really generic framework. And we took that and applied it to a recent project in Myanmar, where we wanted to map terrestrial ecosystems, and the same sort of approach, a really nice training set, a bunch of predictors developed from Landsat archive data that allowed us to assign each of those pixels to an individual ecosystem type, and we developed a wall-to-wall map of the terrestrial ecosystems of Myanmar with that. Now, some really interesting findings. One is that we discovered for the area where Landsat data was available that there was a global decline of tidal flats over the full 30-year period of the analysis. These areas were focused mainly on places such as South Korea and China and the Middle East, and places where the Landsat archive is deep back into the 1980s. But back in the 1980s, there was only one Landsat satellite, so there wasn't data everywhere on Earth. So we could only do it for 16% of the world. By 2001, there are a few more satellites that we could use for this, and we did this analysis of the last 15 years of change, and we found that there was no significant global decline. There was a small decline in area, but it didn't really equate to how much reclamation we knew had happened on the planet. And so one of the things that might have led to that is that there's been an increase of sediment flows out of rivers to do with deforestation. So there's actually more mud along the coastline now than there was in the past. Another interesting one that we found was that a lot of the losses that we detected were actually to a different coastal ecosystem type. So we lose mudflats, and the replacement land use was not an airport, it was actually mangroves, which were marching across the mudflats in some places, and in some places on Earth, they were actually planted in their millions on mudflats. And so it was a source of loss of mudflat, but the coastal ecosystem itself is still there, and a lot of the ecosystem services that it was providing are still there. So what that means is it just got me thinking when I was starting to develop this DECRA project. It was really that intertidal ecosystems, those connected ones, mangroves, mudflats, and salt marshes, from the very high tide line to the sort of low tide line, are majorly dynamic, and they change really quickly. You can go to the coastline here in Townsville and you can see dead mangroves that were sort of a big patch of mangroves only 10 years ago, and they're dead now and replaced by mudflats just due to natural coastal processes. And you can find places where coastal ecosystems are sort of migrating in response to changed coastal processes or to sea level rise. And this paper here, these two papers actually suggest that, we can already see the impact of sea level rise in a lot of places around the world's coastline. And the figure down the bottom is what they're calling ghost forests, which is the transition of former terrestrial forests, which are being flooded by now ultra high tides and becoming a coastal wetland. And so that's sort of one thing. If we give room to coastal ecosystems to move, we really expect them to be able to persist if they're given that room to move and there's enough sort of sediment for them to establish on. Now, this process or this set of processes has led to just major uncertainty about the future of these ecosystems on the global scale. And in fact, our sort of current best global simulation model suggests that there could be potentially a 60% increase in these 3 coastal wetlands globally, as well as a sort of up to 30% decrease, depending on how much we allow them to move. And so what this suggests is that, it's not just a story of loss, which is kind of what I first came to this topic about. And I think a lot of people are thinking about losses as being the only dynamic in the coastal zone. There's actually another one, and that's that gains can occur, and we really should be just making sure that we're looking for them at the same time. Just a note that the different colours on this graph are different assumptions in their simulation model. But to take away, the story is not just negative. The story is that potentially there's an increase under some circumstances. Now, with that, there's also been this increase in the area of land on deltas globally due to increased sediment outflows from rivers caused by deforestation in catchments. And so we're seeing some deltas grow. There obviously many are sinking and many are eroding as well. But for the top 100 deltas globally, which is this paper in Nature last year showed, there's actually been an increase in global land area. And so with an increase in global land area on deltas, you'd expect that there could also be an increase in those intertidal ecosystems that occur on the delta front, such as salt marshes and mangroves and tidal mudflats. But quite amazingly, I still find this quite amazing, there's no real large-scale empirical basis to solve this problem. We don't really yet have a monitoring system that allows us to, with confidence, reduce the uncertainty in those global simulations and get a good understanding of whether or not there are new areas of coastal ecosystems on the planet, as we expect with our simulation models and theory and mechanistic models as well. There's really no large-scale basis to solve that. And so if we're going to go about trying to make something that can help us track the distribution and change of these 3 coastal ecosystems globally, salt marsh, mangroves and mudflats, we really need to make sure it's not just dealing with losses. It's not focusing just on a loss component. We need to make sure that we're able to detect new areas of these coastal ecosystems. And also we need to be able to solve this problem of sometimes you lose a single coastal ecosystem like mudflat, but it's actually turned into a mangrove. And if we wait another 10 years, it might be back to mudflat again. So any global monitoring system needs to be able to solve this problem. Now, a question you might ask is, well, there are some global maps. There's a global mudflat map. I just introduced it to you. There's also a global mangrove map, which is a really nice product as well. And then the only salt marsh map that's currently available is a database, basically a collection of everybody else's maps into one single place. The answer is no, we can't really use these. For example, this example here in New Zealand shows that there's about a 50% overlap between these 2 coastal ecosystems in just one bay. And that is caused by a lot of things, but mainly because each of these ecosystems are highly dynamic. They're always moving just a little bit. They're a linear feature in the coastal zone, so they're not that amenable to pixel-based remote sensing when there's only one 30-metre strip of a coastal ecosystem. And in some cases, like this patch of mangroves in Myanmar, this is a shrubland mangrove, so they're really small. They're less than 2 metres high. It's a mangrove ecosystem on a tidal flat. But it just illustrates, if we're trying to make a map of mangroves, would we put this bay in as a mangrove ecosystem or as a mudflat ecosystem? And those sort of inconsistencies just make it really hard to control for error when we're interested in the global dynamics of intertidal ecosystems and how they're changing. So with that as a background, I developed a DECRA project which aimed to sort of solve this problem using satellite remote sensing. And my 2 key collaborators on this are Mitch Lyons at UNSW and Tom Worthington in Cambridge University. We all work on global scale maps these days. Mitch has been developing the Allen Coral Atlas and been leading the classification workflow for making the first high resolution map of coral reefs on the planet. And and Tom has been working on the distribution of restoration opportunities on mangroves. So we got together and we decided that, you know, this is an opportunity for us to really try to develop something which is akin to Global Forest Watch data, which has its flaws, but is useful nonetheless, for monitoring losses and gains of salt marsh mangroves and tidal flood ecosystems. So in the time remaining, I'll just explain the model to you. I haven't finished my deco yet, so this is sort of a quick sneak preview of what we've got and what I'm planning to do with it, as well as some of the results already. But it's worth introducing the model itself, which is a global remote sensing model that is actually generalizable to a whole bunch of remote sensing problems, even though we've focused it on intertidal ecosystems. It follows the sort of classic remote sensing, supervised remote sensing pipeline of having a really accurate training set. So pixels on the planet that represent known things, building a set of predictor layers that are informative for a machine learning classifier to be able to assign a single pixel on the Earth's surface to a type that's in the training set. A set of classification models, machine learning classification models, whose job it is to assign a single pixel to one of those target map classes, which is in the training set as well. And then developing a set of products that are sort of useful to the world to use for science and for conservation. And so I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail, and I'll be pretty brief about it. But if anyone does want to find out more about this type of modelling approach, you can get in contact with me or read some of my papers, for instance, and you'll get a deeper understanding of this sort of modelling pipeline. The training set that underpins the new global intertidal change data set, which is what we're calling it, is a set of about 62,000 points developed primarily down here at JCU in Townsville, primarily by about 3 or 4 people. Some of them are on the call. And what we have is about 62,000 points, where each one of those is a 30-metre pixel of a known type at a known time. So green here is a point which represents mangroves. The sort of dark orange is a salt marsh point, and then the yellow is a mudflat point. There are 3 target ecosystems. I've got 5 here because we also have some coral data in it now, and we also have seagrass and kelp, and you know we're slowly growing it for other purposes, not sort of described in this talk. The data came from about 150 different papers where in the lab we had a research assistant of mine called Robert go through these papers, find the figures, find the site on an app that we developed for the purpose of collecting training data, and then add it to our training library. In addition to that, there's about 500 hours of looking at satellite images and Google Earth imagery, and going to places where I've travelled and incorporating data that way as well. This training set is the core of a publication that we're going to deliver, which is a new training set of all coastal ecosystems for the world. So it's going to be freely available in the hope that other people can use it and make better maps than what we've been able to in this project. Training data, okay, and then predictor layers. So the next thing we need to make a map is some information about what's on the Earth's surface right now, that we can use our training set to develop a classification model that has a good chance of accurately predicting what a single pixel on the Earth's surface is. For this project, we developed 85 of these layers. And about 80 of them are different ways of looking at the Landsat archive. So we use all images in the Landsat archive in the coastal zone, and we process them in ways that helps the classifier have a good chance at classifying them correctly. So an example of that is processing Landsat data to NDVI, so that it helps us distinguish something green, like a mangrove, from something brown or wet, like a mudflat. So we have about 80 of these predictor layers. We also have some other biophysical layers like slope and elevation, which are also informative for that. So in about the first year of this project, it took us about 300 days to develop enough of these data layers to make a time series product. 300 days on Earth Engine, which given that the first mudflat map took 40 days to run, 300 days, this project is much, much bigger than the old one because we're trying to do a lot more with our classification. As an example of one of these predictor layers, this is Townsville here. This is elevation. You can see Castle Hill up here, and this is informative in our classifier because a pixel that's at 300 meters elevation is unlikely to be a coastal ecosystem. So it helps any classifier sort of determine or estimate the class membership of a single pixel. Slope is similar. The cliff on the front of Castle Hill is unlikely to be a coastal ecosystem because it's just too steep to be an intertidal ecosystem that sort of has to have a slope sufficient for a 2 or 3 meter tide to be able to pass over it and then expose it across the tidal cycle. Now with the Landsat data, like we used 1 million images, but they're not always that useful to us. And this example here from Western Australia is just to show that clouds are still a major issue in any remote sensing project. But not having to download images anymore, not having to wait for hundreds and hundreds of images means that we can now interrogate entire archives of satellite data and find pixels that are useful for our purpose. And so this example here is finding the best cloud-free pixel in a 3-year period and building a single image, which we use as a predictor, from what might be 60 or 70 images in total. So each one of these pixels might have come from a different image within this time frame, but it allows us to build a basis of a global classification model that's not going to be limited by cloud cover. And all these points here represent training data. So that's sort of a major breakthrough that Google Earth Engine allowed us to do, and a couple of other systems are allowing us to do as well now, is solve this problem of clouds. Which is really important for ecosystems, particularly in the tropics. What we can also do with this type of approach is build new layers that are informative, not just NDVI or some other sort of straightforward index. What I'm showing here is the standard deviation of an index across all of these. And what you're looking at is pixels that are really bright here are ones that have sort of sometimes wet and sometimes dry. They have a high variance across those 60 images in that time frame. And what that suggests is that it's a tidal mudflat that on any given image, it could be completely wet or completely dry, meaning the pixel value is actually is really, really sort of variable over time. The darker pixels in this image are ones that are basically the same all the time. They have a really low variance. They're always brown, or they're always green, or they're always wet. But those ones that are sort of variously inundated by the tide are the ones that have a high pixel variance. So it's quite a new way of incorporating new information into classification models that wasn't really possible 15 years ago because we just couldn't handle the amount of data that we can now. Right, and then now we're up to the global intertidal change model itself. So this is the new model. It's much more advanced than the mudflat model, which was a single model. This one actually works in unison. There's 3 different stages to it. And each stage is designed to sort of get at those problems that I highlighted in the start of the talk of ecosystems sort of changing a lot and those dynamic ecotones that are really hard to make accurate maps for. So the first stage of this classification is firstly just to estimate the distribution of any one of those ecosystems, salt marsh, mudflats or mangroves. So we built a global distribution map of intertidal ecosystems as a whole, which some groups call tidal wetlands. So it's the first map of tidal wetlands globally. And what we're looking at here is actually the probability of occurrence, or the probability that this pixel is a coastal wetland versus not being a coastal wetland, where yellow is very, very high, like the classifier suggests that it probably is, and purple suggests that it's probably not. So this is a pixel value of 0 to 100, where 100 is every single time we estimate it. Every time we run the model, we think it's a coastal wetland, and purple means it almost never comes out as that. The second one is we take that map of the distribution of coastal wetlands globally, and we say, well, okay, what type of coastal wetland are you? And we let the classifier decide based on that body of evidence of 62,000 training points, what a pixel is within a place that we know is tidal, it is a coastal wetland. And this little example here has green and orange and yellow. Yellow is tidal flat, green is mangrove, and orange is salt marsh. I'll show you a bigger example in a minute. But the purpose of this is to show that we sort of have this staged classification workflow to try to get at those problems that have meant that the existing data sets are not that useful for this type of analysis. And then lastly, a bit like Global Forest Watch, what we do is we say, well, okay, if you've changed since the first time step in our analysis, which is 1991, if you've changed from a coastal wetland to a not coastal wetland over our 20-year time period, we can say you're either lost, or if you've changed from not being a coastal wetland, but you are in the last time step, you're a new coastal wetland. And these are these new green ones here, which required an entirely new training set where we take any pixels that have changed, and then we develop another classification whose job it is to say, yes, it's changed. And if yes, are you a gain pixel or a lost pixel? And to support that classification, we use the difference of Landsat values, so about another 80 predictors, but this time we're looking at the difference in values. Has NDVI gone from low to high or high to low? And then we use this probability layer to fit a linear model per pixel, which sort of indicates the trajectory of a pixel. Is it getting more and more like a coastal wetland over time, or less and less like a coastal wetland over time? So it's a different sort of remote sensing workflow to the classic ones that we were running just 10 years ago. An example, this is the Rakhine in Myanmar, and the Rakhine is sort of northwest Myanmar facing Bangladesh and India, and it's mainly dominated by mangroves and tidal flats. There's a bit of salt marsh there, but what you're looking at here is a small patch of coastline 10 kilometers across this bottom axis. First thing we do is we say, are you a coastal wetland or not? And we get these bright yellow pixels which have a high probability of being a coastal wetland. We say, right, if you're over 50% probability, we're going to call you a coastal wetland. And that's just a standard step in a random forest classification. So with this grey, we've said, right, all these pixels are probably coastal wetland. And then what we do is we say, okay, well, now that we think you're a coastal wetland, what type of coastal wetland are you? And we estimate the class membership to a single intertidal ecosystem type for those ones. And here, yellow is tidal mudflat, mangrove is green, and there's a tiny bit of salt marsh in there suggested by the model as well. Now, they're the first two stages of the classifier. And so what we're really interested in is that question of loss and gain. So I've got another example here from Singapore. This whole island here is the island of Singapore. And over here is Malaysia, Peninsular Malaysia. Brown is that distribution of coastal wetlands, as I showed before. And then what we do is we run that change classifier to say, okay, are you new or have you disappeared over the last 20 years? And we get these patches of blue, which are new, and these patches of red, which have disappeared. And to sort of add another depth of information to this entire data set is we then can work out these new patches, what they are, in this case, mangrove and mudflat. And in addition, because we ran this over 7 time steps since 1999, we can work out what year these ecosystems sort of first presented themselves to the satellites. And here you can see the slow growth of a coastal wetland, mangroves and mudflats, from the period of 2004 to 2019, where the patch right at the bottom is sort of only recently showed up, and the patch at the top showed up 15 years ago. This is just a natural coastal dynamic of sediments moving around the world. So this happens all the time on Earth, and this is exactly what we were trying to detect with this analysis. Now for loss, we can do the same thing. We can first work out, well, what were you in 2001 or the first time step, 1999? So here we can say this used to be mangrove, and it's not there anymore. And we can find in the data set the last year that we observed it, which in this case is 2013 in southern Malaysia. A patch of mangroves has just disappeared. And what we're looking at in this case is a new oil port that was developed and launched in 2012, according to this this news article. So, yeah, similar to global forest loss, we have lost year. Global forest loss doesn't have lost type; it's just got loss and lost year. But we've got one extra layer of information here to answer our question. And a couple of examples of what we can detect. This is the loss and gain dynamic of the Yellow River mouth, which is a massive river in China. And in 1996, this southern channel here was blocked. And what happened when it got blocked is that the sediment from the Yellow River started heading north out of a different channel and depositing tidal mudflats and eventually salt marsh in this new area up here. And the old river mouth started eroding and sinking. And we detect that with our classification workflow. We get this big patch of loss in the south and a big patch of gain in the north. And it's about 50-50 right now in this image. About losses equals gains, or gains equal losses. Another dynamic we've been able to detect on the global scale. So remember, these maps are global, so 30-meter pixels for the entire world's coastline, as far north as we can reasonably do with Landsat data. Here we're detecting a coastal restoration project in the UK. So this is the largest ever coastal wetland restoration project near London, where a whole bunch of sediment from the Cross City Tunnel was brought into what used to be farmland. And this entire site was turned back into coastal salt marshes and tidal mudflats, and we were able to detect that from space. So that's like a really nice dynamic. Here we just see that the only things to have changed in this patch are new coastal wetlands where they weren't in the past. And then at the same time, like in addition to deforestation and reclamation, we can detect some other pretty amazing dynamics of the world's coastal zone. This big patch of red here is on the southern Andaman Islands. And in 2004, there was a magnitude 9.1 earthquake, you probably remember it, which led to a tsunami across Aceh and Indonesia and Myanmar and all of Southeast Asia, really. But what happened at the same time is that close to the earthquake epicenter, there was this huge tectonic subsidence event, and some places subsided two meters in just a few minutes. And what's happened here is that the mangroves that used to occur here, you can see it in 2005, they're still there, but they're dead now, got drowned. They subsided by 2 meters in a short period, and basically they're not in an environment which can support mangroves anymore, and eventually died off completely. And we detected that sort of dynamic from space. And so far we've found 3 places on the planet where we've been able to detect this loss event, really rapid loss event, that might be indicative of what a sea level rise, like a sea level rise dynamic might present in the future. Yeah, and we've I guess we've cross-referenced this to papers and other things that have helped us understand why these patches might have showed up in the data set. And in this case, there were at least 10 or 15 papers documenting the losses of mangroves due to the tectonic subsidence associated with this massive earthquake. So it's really quite amazing. Now, the results, this is where I'm kind of in the depths of this analysis right now, writing it up. But some of the interesting things just to come out in the last 5 minutes of my talk. Yeah, losses occurred all around the world, and they occurred basically where we know they're occurring. So Myanmar, I've done a lot of work there, and the mangrove degradation in Myanmar is well known and well reported. We detect that sort of coastal reclamation that I introduced with the mudflat project around a lot of Asia. And even in the Niger Delta, where there's just an enormous oil industry that's killing off mangroves with subsidence and pollution, we can detect that type of event as well. And also these loss of coastal wetlands in the Mississippi Delta are mostly caused by a hurricane, which just blew apart all the vegetated coastal ecosystems, and they were converted into open water pretty quickly after that event. And then again, yeah, in the places we know where these events are happening, we kind of detected them. But remember, I'm talking about gain as well. That's what we also want to know about. So papers which say, mangroves have been lost, 4,000 square kilometres of mangroves in the last 20 years. Some of those papers don't ever even investigate whether or not there are any new mangroves on the planet in that time, but we can do that now. And what's really interesting is that some of the new mangroves on the planet are happening in the same places as we're losing mangroves. And there's a couple of explanations for this. Or, the other component here is that if you lose a mangrove, it mobilizes a whole bunch of sediment, which in the end becomes a tidal flat. So we're detecting that around the world as well. So the new gains of coastal wetlands in Asia, which are mostly tidal flats, often occur if a reclamation project has been built, but the sediment hasn't been captured. So it's basically just pumped back out to sea, eventually remobilized and settles on that outside wall of a reclamation project. Mangroves in the Sundarbans, they're marching out to sea with sediment. So the more sediment that gets dropped at the Ganges River mouth here is basically driving recruitment of a lot of mangroves, and that's really observable in our data set as well. So it's really interesting. When we get losses, we get co-located gains fairly often. And then at the same time, we get transitions. So this is where an ecosystem that was formerly a tidal flat is now a salt marsh, or which was formerly a mangrove is now a tidal flat, all happening in sort of these similar places where coastal dynamics are at play, deltas, large deltas, places where there's a lot of change. We're going to analyse this one in particular pretty deeply because it's also an indication that we might be getting those sorts of ghost forests that I introduced at the start, where high tides are sort of allowing gains and transitions and changes in ecosystem types caused by just new ingress of salt water in places where they weren't in the past. Interesting, and sort of aligns with other papers that have studied mangrove loss. The majority of the losses that we detected were mangroves, about 4,000 square kilometres over 20 years, which is about the same as two other papers that have worked on the global extent and change of mangroves. What you can see here is that with any given loss below the zero, there's also a gain though, and this is sort of the novelty of our analysis workflows, that we can detect that and work out net losses. Now, the net loss is always below zero across the whole time series, which is alarming. It means that coastal ecosystems on the planet are being lost and they're not being sufficiently replaced in time to sort of offset those losses. But if we only talked about losses, we'd be massively overestimating the amount of coastal wetlands lost globally. And then we also found that almost like the majority of coastal ecosystem losses on the planet in the last 20 years have occurred in Asia, and in particular in Indonesia, China, and Myanmar, which I think is also pretty well established. But we are finding that there's these new patches that have substantially offset some of those losses. So what's next? So that's just a brief introduction to the data set and what we're doing with it. We're going to deliver it open access. The code is going to be open access as well, just to promote this sort of extra development of these types of maps for coastlines and for other ecosystems as well. The training data set we're publishing, and I've since talked in a couple of other global projects to contributing data as well. So Global Mangrove Watch and the Coral Atlas are going to contribute data, and already have done, to a data set that's going to be useful for anyone who wants to make global maps of coastal ecosystems. Just recently, we've been sort of selected by the Clean Energy Regulator in Australia here to implement this change mapping workflow on the so-called blue carbon ecosystems in Australia. And so they've taken our code and are implementing it on the production environment, where it's going to underpin the blue carbon offset method for the next, well, potentially the next 25 years. But at the moment, it's a proof of concept to support some Commonwealth government decision making. And in addition to all of that, we're also doing a whole bunch of other analyses to use this data set to help us understand things like, can we put coastal restoration projects in places which are likely to gain, just to get a better bang for your buck, I guess. trying to understand what's driving the continued loss of coastal ecosystems, and also really trying to understand that transitions data set, which is really interesting because it really is driven by climate change, a lot of those transitions that we detected. So with that, I mean, there's probably about 100 people to thank in this project, but over the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a fair core, which have helped from the sort of coastal ecosystem ecology side of things, the conservation side of things, and also the really technical how to run massive global analyses on Google Earth Engine. And just to finish, just a spruik of a postdoc I've got advertised, just went up, I think yesterday or the day before. If you're interested in working on the change of coastal ecosystems, then there's a postdoc down here in Townsville. And I'm also hunting for a PhD student who wants to work on topics surrounding this. So with that, thanks a lot for the opportunity to give a talk to TESS. I've been wanting to come up there for a long time, so it's really nice to